Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
A clockwork vision of an economy, one where prices adjust with mechanical precision to balance supply and demand across all markets simultaneously, held a powerful sway over economic thought for nearly a century. This conception, crystallized in the work of Leon Walras, offered a beautiful, self-contained universe of perfect coordination. Its intellectual descendants, most notably the Arab model of the mid-20th century, endowed this vision with a level of mathematical rigor that was breathtaking. The model proved, under a set of demanding assumptions, that a state of general equilibrium could exist, yet, for all its formal elegance, this deterministic world felt profoundly alien to the lived experience of economic decision-making. It was a world without surprise, without ambiguity, a world where every participant possessed complete information about the future. The critical intellectual challenge, therefore, was to reconcile the powerful logic of equilibrium with the pervasive fog of uncertainty that shrouds all human enterprise. Into this theoretical landscape stepped the young Yuri Orlov, whose early work initiated a quiet revolution. He perceived that the core limitation of the classical framework was its treatment of information as a given, a perfect, and universally shared commodity. Orlov's foundational contribution was to reimagine general equilibrium from the ground up, conceiving of it as a probabilistic phenomenon shaped by the strategic interactions of agents with incomplete knowledge. His work proposed that an economy finds its balance a different way, through a complex web of beliefs, expectations, and gambles on an unknowable future. This perspective shifted the entire basis of analysis from a static, deterministic calculation to a dynamic, stochastic process. Orlov's initial breakthrough was articulated in a series of papers in the late 1960s, culminating in his seminal 1970 article in Econometrica titled Equilibrium Under Subjective Uncertainty. Here, he directly engaged with the architecture of the Arab model. That model had ingeniously handled future uncertainty through the concept of state-contingent commodities, a contract for a good to be delivered only if a specific, observable future state of the world came to pass. In theory, if markets existed for every conceivable contingent commodity, a complete, efficient allocation could be achieved before the future was known. Orlov recognized the genius of this formulation, while also identifying its practical impossibility. His solution was to internalize the uncertainty within the decision-making process of the agents themselves. He achieved this by massively weaving together two distinct intellectual threads of the theory of subjective probability, as advanced by figures like Bruno Defini and Leonard Savage, and the game-theoretic framework of John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. From Defini, Orlov took the idea that probabilities are expressions of an individual's degree of belief rather than objective frequencies. This allowed him to model economic agents who formed their own unique, subjective forecasts about future events, such as technological breakthroughs or shifts in consumer taste. From von Neumann and Morgenstern's asterisk theory of games and economic behavior asterisk, he borrowed the machinery to analyze strategic interdependence. Orlov's agents were players in a vast, intricate game. Their optimal choice depended on their beliefs about the future and, crucially, on their beliefs about what other agents believed. The Orlovian model, therefore, described an equilibrium as a state of mutual consistency among these subjective beliefs and strategic plans. An equilibrium price was a price that cleared markets given the distribution of agents' probabilistic expectations. For example, in his model, the price of a stock reflected a weighted average of all market participants' divergent predictions about a company's future earnings, with the weights determined by their wealth and risk tolerance. This was a profound departure from the classical view of a price as a pure reflection of underlying physical scarcity. In Orlov's world, prices were saturated with information, belief, and psychology. His work provided a formal language for understanding how a market could aggregate millions of disparate, personal forecasts into a single, coherent price signal. The intellectual lineage of this work is clear. Orlov stood firmly on the shoulders of Kenneth Arrow and Gerhard de Bruyck, using their mathematical tools of typology and convex analysis as a starting point. His contribution was to show how the rigorous framework could be made more flexible and realistic. He was also deeply influenced by the Soviet school of mathematical economics, particularly the work of Leonid Kantorovich on optimal planning and resource allocation. While Kantorovich's work was often applied to centrally planned systems, Orlov adapted its optimization techniques to model the decentralized decision-making of market agents facing scarcity. The impact of Orlov's early publications was immediate and lasting, creating ripples that expanded into disparate fields of economic inquiry. His formulation of equilibrium under uncertainty provided a crucial conceptual precursor to the field of information economics that blossomed in the following decade. Scholars like George Aklov, with his analysis of markets with asymmetric information, and Michael Spence, who studied market signaling, were exploring the practical consequences of the very informational frictions that Orlov had placed at the center of his theoretical model. His work gave them a general equilibrium foundation upon which to build their more specific analyses of market failures. Furthermore, his integration of probabilistic expectations and dynamic choice laid an essential piece of groundwork for the development of modern finance theory. The Nobel-winning work of Robert Merton and Myron Scholes on option pricing, for instance, relies on a continuous non-stochastic process to model asset prices, a direct intellectual descendant of Orlov's discrete time probabilistic framework. His models helped establish the legitimacy of treating financial markets as complex systems for processing information and allocating risk. Perhaps his most enduring legacy in this area is the conceptual pathway he forged toward the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, or DSGE, models that would come to dominate macroeconomics at the end of the 20th century. These large-scale computational models, used by central banks and policy institutions worldwide, treat the entire economy as an interacting system of agents optimizing or ton in the face of random shocks. The core intellectual architecture of these models, intertemporal optimization, rational expectations, and stochastic shocks, is a direct, albeit more complex, realization of the vision first articulated in Orlov's early papers. He provided a theoretical license to view the macroeconomy as a system perpetually adapting to new information, having established a new theoretical language for describing economies under uncertainty. Orlov's attention would subsequently turn toward a profoundly practical question: how to allocate finite resources within such a volatile and unpredictable system. This pivot from abstract economic description to prescriptive allocation theory marked a defining chapter in Orlov's intellectual journey. The challenge he confronted was immense. How could a central authority, or indeed any large organization, make optimal decisions about distributing limited materials, energy, or capital when the future itself was a landscape of probabilities? The question was especially pressing within the command economies of the mid-20th century, where the ghost of inefficiency haunted every 5-year plan. The prevailing mathematical tools, while powerful, often presupposed a world of greater certainty than reality offered. Orlov's profound contribution was the development of what he termed sequential resource optimization under stochastic perturbations. This was a framework that used the principles of dynamic programming with a physicist's intuition for random processes. The intellectual debt to the American mathematician Richard Bellman is clear and acknowledged in Orlov's own papers. Orlov took Bellman's principle of optimality, the elegant idea that an optimal policy has the property that whatever the initial state and initial decision, or the remaining decisions, must constitute an optimal policy with regard to the state resulting from the first decision, and applied it with ferocious creativity to economic allocation. He also deeply engaged with the work of his own countryman, the Nobel laureate Leonid Kantorovich. Kantorovich had brilliantly used linear programming to solve static allocation problems, figuring out the single best way to distribute resources at a fixed point in time. Orlov saw this as a foundational, yet incomplete, picture. He sought to animate it, to introduce the dimension of time and the disruptive power of chance. His methodology involved modeling an economic system as a series of states, where each state was defined by a vector of available resources. The system would transition from one state to another over discrete time intervals. The crucial innovation was that these transitions were probabilistic, governed by a matrix of transition probabilities that captured the likelihood of external shocks, a poor harvest, a supply chain disruption, a technological breakthrough. The allocator's task was to choose a course of action at each step that would maximize a long-term objective function, typically representing total production or social welfare, while knowing that future states were governed by chance. The solution was a policy function, a rule that specified the optimal allocation for any possible state the system might find itself in. One of his oft-cited papers from this period, Optimal Trajectories in a Stochastic Resource Space, lays this out with mathematical precision, employing a modified Bellman equation that incorporates a term for the variance of expected outcomes, a subtle but vital addition that accounts for risk aversion. A powerful, tangible application of this theory emerged from his consultancy on the Virgin Lands campaign in Soviet Kazakhstan. The project was a massive agricultural undertaking fraught with uncertainty, particularly regarding rainfall and soil quality. Traditional planning methods, based on average yields, were proving disastrously inadequate. Orlov's team was brought in to develop a more robust model for allocating seed, fertilizer, and machinery. Using his sequential resource optimization framework, they modeled the agricultural system with states defined by soil moisture levels, early season temperature readings, and stored grain reserves. The stochastic shocks were, of course, the unpredictable weather patterns of the Central Asian steppe. The resulting policy function was a dynamic guide for regional administrators. It suggested, for example, that in a year starting with low soil moisture, a larger proportion of resources should be held in reserve or diverted to more drought-resistant crops, even at the cost of lower potential yield in a best-case scenario. This flew in the face of conventional, quota-driven thinking. While the overall political management of the campaign had its own profound issues, Orlov's modeling demonstrated a new way of thinking about large-scale project management under deep uncertainty. It provided a mathematical argument for flexibility and adaptation, a concept often at odds with rigid, top-down planning. The enduring relevance of this work is perhaps its most remarkable feature. The core logic of Orlov's framework is visible today in the sophisticated algorithms that govern global supply chains. When a multinational corporation decides how much inventory to hold in various warehouses around the world, it is solving an Orlovian problem. The states or inventory levels, the shocks or demand fluctuations and shipping delays, and the policy function is the algorithm that automatically reorders stock to balance holding costs against the risk of stockouts. His work prefigured the entire field of stochastic inventory control. Similarly, modern energy grid management, which must balance the predictable output of fossil fuel plants with the intermittent, unpredictable supply from wind and solar farms, relies on dynamic optimization models that are direct intellectual descendants of Orlov's early formulations. They seek an optimal policy for storing and distributing power in a system perpetually buffeted by the stochasticity of nature. His influence propagated through the academic world, particularly in the fields of operations research and management science. The work of scholars like Aoi Federgrun at Columbia University, whose research on supply chain management and inventory control has become foundational, builds directly upon the premise of optimizing complex systems under uncertainty that Orlov helped to pioneer. Federgrun's models for multi-echelon inventory systems, which coordinate stock levels across a whole network of suppliers, factories, and retailers, can be seen as a highly developed and specialized application of the general principles Orlov articulated. The path from a theoretical model for allocating fertilizer on the Kazakh steppe to the algorithm managing the global flow of microchips is a surprisingly direct one, illustrating the immense power of a well-posed mathematical abstraction. His work provided a grammar for discussing and solving some of the most complex logistical challenges of the modern world. The intellectual framework that allowed for the optimization of vast, complex systems possessed an inherent generality. A mind accustomed to modeling the allocation of resources across a continent could readily turn its attention to a different, far more perilous form of allocation, the distribution of national wealth between civilian prosperity and military power. Yuri Orlov's trajectory followed this precise intellectual path. He carried the tools of systems analysis and mathematical modeling from the domain of Soviet economic planning into the chilling calculus of the Cold War arms race. Here, the problem was a different species of inefficiency. The challenge involved understanding a system where two competing actors, each pursuing its own security with relentless logic, produced a collective state of profound insecurity and economic hemorrhage. It was a paradox crying out for a formal description. Orlov's work in this sphere was deeply informed by the pioneering efforts of others who had attempted to map the contours of conflict with mathematics. He stood on the the shoulders of figures like Louis Fry Richardson, the English physicist and meteorologist whose system of coupled differential equations, developed in the years following the First World War, provided the first great mathematical model of an arms race. Richardson's model, elegant in its simplicity, proposed that the rate of a nation's arms buildup, let's say dx dt, is proportional to the level of its rival's arsenal, y, while being tempered by the economic burden of its own arsenal, x. A parallel equation would describe the rival's behavior. Olive recognized the power of this framework, yet he also perceived its limitations. Richardson's model captured the dynamic feedback loop of threat and response, but Olive sought to embed this dynamic within a richer economic context, one grounded in the theory of rational choice and strategic interaction. For this, he drew upon the conceptual arsenal of game theory, a field that had been given its modern, formidable shape by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern, and later applied to international strategy with penetrating insight by Thomas Schelling. Schelling's 1960 masterpiece, The Strategy of Conflict, had demonstrated how the logic of games, from zero-sum contests to dilemmas of cooperation, like the famous prisoner's dilemma, they illuminate the bizarre behaviors of nuclear-armed superpowers. Olive's unique contribution was to synthesize these two streams of thought. He sought to build models that combined Richardson's dynamic systems approach with the economic utility calculations central to Schelling's game theory. An Olivian model of an arms race would look something like this. Imagine two states, each with a national utility function it seeks to maximize. This function would contain several variables. One term would represent security, perhaps expressed as a function of the ratio of its own military strength to its rivals. Another crucial term would represent economic welfare, derived from the nation's gross domestic product minus the crippling cost of its military expenditure. The state's decision is how to allocate its budget between guns and butter to maximize this overall utility. The complexity, of course, is that its rival is simultaneously making the exact same calculation. The security of one is a function of the spending of the other, creating a tightly coupled system of strategic interdependence. Using the tools of differential game theory, Olive could analyze the equilibrium points of such a system. His analysis would demonstrate, with mathematical finality, how two perfectly rational states, each acting in its own perceived self-interest, could become locked in a stable but ruinous equilibrium. This is the Nash equilibrium of the arms race, a state where neither side has a unilateral incentive to decrease its spending, because doing so would cede a strategic advantage. Yet both would be far better off if they could mutually agree to disarm. The model provides a formal, economic explanation for the Cold War's central tragedy, a stable equilibrium of mutual terror and economic waste. It transforms a political observation into a mathematical inevitability, given the initial assumptions about state behavior. While his circumstances, as a dissident within the Soviet Union, precluded the kind of institutional support enjoyed by analysts at, for instance, the Rand Corporation in the United States, Olive's ideas found their expression in essays circulated through samizdat and later published in the West, such as his 1986 piece, The Possibility of a Catastrophe-Free Development. He articulated a vision for global security rooted in this kind of rational, systems-level thinking. He argued for the creation of international mechanisms for verification and control that would alter the payoffs in the strategic game. His proposal was to change the very structure of the utility function for states by introducing reliable third-party monitoring, which would reduce the security risk of disarmament and make cooperation the new rational equilibrium. This mode of thinking, which fuses economics, game theory, and systems dynamics to analyze security policy, became a cornerstone of modern peace science and conflict resolution studies. Scholars like Martin Shubik at Yale University, who dedicated his career to the mathematical modeling of strategic behavior in economics and defense, explored parallel lines of inquiry, creating sophisticated models of deterrence, arms control, and economic warfare. Shubik's work on dollar auctions and the game theory of threats provided a rigorous academic foundation for many of the same concepts Olive was exploring from his unique vantage point. The analyses produced by institutions like the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, which provide data-driven assessments of global military expenditures and arms transfers, are the direct intellectual descendants of this approach. They operate on the Olivian premise that to manage the problem of global arms, one must first measure and model it with economic and mathematical precision. Through this work, Olive helped to translate the abstract language of functions and equilibria into a grammar for discussing human survival, demonstrating that the coldest logic can sometimes be the most powerful tool for advocating peace. The very act of translating the precarious balance of global power into a system of equations represents a profound intellectual leap. It carries with it an immense clarifying power, the ability to slice through political rhetoric and expose the stark economic logic underneath. Yet, any such translation from the messy, vibrant, and often irrational sphere of human affairs into the pristine language of mathematics necessitates a critical examination. The elegance of a model, its internal consistency and mathematical beauty, must always be weighed against the aspects of reality it omits. The legacy of Yuri Orlov's economic work, therefore, resides as much in the questions his models raise as in the answers they provide. Their enduring value is found through a careful appraisal of both their formidable strengths and their inherent, illuminating limitations. The primary strength of Orlov's approach was its radical parsimony. In a world saturated with ideological justifications for military expansion, his models offered a stark, minimalist calculus. Consider again his formulation of the gross world product, GW, as a function diminished by global military expenditure. This was a conceptual scalpel. It stripped away arguments about national pride, geopolitical necessity, and historical grievance to pose a single, devastatingly simple question: what is the economic cost of our collective insecurity? This method forced a common ground for debate. Two opposing superpowers, speaking entirely different political languages, could at least, in principle, understand the logic of a shared economic output being diverted from productive use. This quantitative framework, championed by Olive from within a closed society, was a bid to create a universal grammar for peace, one rooted in the objective language of resource allocation. His work shared the spirit with the efforts of economists like Wassily Learnev, whose input-output analysis provided a structural map of an economy. Orlov was, in effect, attempting a kind of input-output analysis for the entire global system, with peace and prosperity as the desired outputs, and military spending as a profoundly inefficient input. This analytical clarity, however, was achieved through a set of powerful, simplifying assumptions that form the basis for any serious critique. The most significant of these is the presumption of the rational actor. Orlov's models, in the tradition of classical game theory and much of Cold War systems analysis, treated nations as monolithic entities making calculated decisions to maximize their utility. This is a necessary simplification for modeling, yet it files away the jagged edges of human reality. It presumes a world of chess masters when the board is often occupied by players driven by fear, ideology, historical trauma, and sheer miscalculation. The subsequent Nobel-winning work of psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky on cognitive biases provides a formal vocabulary for these deviations from pure rationality. The prospect theory, for instance, which demonstrates that people weigh losses more heavily than equivalent gains, offers a compelling psychological explanation for the kind of escalatory behavior that a purely rational model struggles to explain. An Orlovian model might calculate the optimal de-escalation path, while a Kahneman-Tversky perspective would highlight why leaders, fearing the political loss of appearing weak, would systematically avoid that path. Furthermore, the most elegant model is helpless without reliable data. For Orlov, this was a monumental obstacle. His equations required figures for military budgets, production capacities, and resource flows information that was among the most jealously guarded state secrets in the Soviet Union and, to a degree, in the West. His attempts to estimate these figures were acts of intellectual courage and ingenuity, yet they were approximations by necessity. His models were like perfectly machined engines designed to run on high-octane fuel, placed in a world where the only available energy source was crude, unrefined, and frequently contaminated with propaganda. Consequently, the true power of his work was perhaps less predictive and more pedagogical. The models served as profound thought experiments, demonstrating the asterisk structure asterisk of the problem even if the precise numerical outputs were open to question. They were tools for thinking, designed to reveal the calamitous economic logic of the arms race itself. The evolution of research in the decades following Orlov's key publications shows a branching of intellectual paths, with some scholars building upon his quantitative foundations and others challenging his core premises. In the field of international relations, research programs like the Correlates of War Project, initiated by J. David Singer at the University of Michigan, represent a direct intellectual succession. This massive undertaking sought to collect vast amounts of quantitative data on the prevalence and severity of international conflicts, operating on the Orlovian principle that understanding war requires first measuring it rigorously. Scholars like Michael D. Ward later extended such approaches by developing sophisticated statistical models to identify the predictors of conflict, incorporating economic, political, and geographic variables in a way that Orlov would have recognized. A more fundamental challenge came from different intellectual traditions. The rise of constructivist theory in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly in the work of Alexander Wundt, offered a profound alternative. Wundt's famous assertion that anarchy is what states make the shift to the focus from material capabilities and rational calculations to the role of shared norms, identities, and intersubjective understandings. From a constructivist viewpoint, the parameters in Orlov's equations, the perceived utility of a weapon, the value placed on security, are themselves the products of social interaction. They are dynamic, shaped by discourse and diplomacy, rather than being fixed inputs for a mathematical calculation. This perspective suggests that changing the game requires changing the player's very understanding of who they are and what they want, a process that occurs outside the formal logic of Orlov's models. Within economics, Orlov's work can be seen as a specific, politically charged application of optimal control theory, the mathematics of finding the best path over time for a dynamic system. His goal was to optimize for global welfare by minimizing military waste. This same mathematical toolkit was being refined and applied to macroeconomic policy by figures like Robert Lucas Jr., who used it to model how rational agents would respond to government policies. While Lucas's work focused on markets and inflation, and Orlov's on missiles and peace, the underlying mathematical quest for an optimal trajectory is strikingly similar. The divergence in their conclusions speaks volumes about the power of initial assumptions. Lucas's models, assuming efficient markets, often yielded conservative policy implications, while Orlov's, assuming a globally suboptimal arms race, yielded a radical call for disarmament. Ultimately, the limitations of Orlov's economic models are what make them so instructive. They reveal the immense difficulty of capturing a system as complex as human society within a formal structure. His work stands as a testament to the power of a certain kind of scientific idealism, the belief that reason and mathematics can illuminate the darkest corners of human behavior. The critiques of his work, from behavioral psychology to constructivist political science, highlight the very factors, bias, identity, belief that make us human. His models were a brilliant attempt to map a coastline, and while later explorers would reveal the complex ecosystems and hidden topographies inland, his initial chart remains an indispensable document of intellectual bravery. It defined the shoreline from which all subsequent explorations would depart. To assess the legacy of Yuri Orlov is to confront a figure whose intellectual trajectory seems almost paradoxical. A life lived across the profound chasm separating the pristine abstractions of theoretical physics from the brittle, messy realities of political persecution. His contributions, however, flow from a single, unifying source and unwavering, almost defiant, faith in the power of rational inquiry and objective truth. The same mind that grappled with the quantum behavior of particles in a synchrotron also sought to delineate the fundamental principles of a healthy, open society. The physicist and the dissident were two expressions of the same core conviction that reality, whether physical or social, is governed by intelligible laws that can be discovered, articulated, and defended. His work in accelerator physics forms a permanent, concrete stratum in the foundations of modern high-energy experiments. The Yerevan synchrotron, a machine whose successful operation owed a great deal to his calculations on particle beam dynamics and nonlinear resonances, became a vital instrument for Soviet science. Colleagues from that era like the Armenian physicist Albert Takulidze, would recall the sheer intellectual force Orlov brought to bear on problems of beam stability, transforming abstract Hamiltonian mechanics into tangible engineering solutions that kept protons circulating with unprecedented precision. Later at Cornell University, his work continued to refine the field. His insights into spin dynamics and methods for overcoming depolarizing resonances in accelerators like the Cornell electron storage ring contributed directly to the success of experiments probing the fundamental structure of matter. This legacy is inscribed in the technical manuals and research papers of accelerator science, a testament to a master craftsman of the invisible architecture that makes particle physics possible. His influence persists in the generations of physicists who learn their craft using machines and techniques that bear the imprint of his analytical rigor. Simultaneously, his formulation of human rights advocacy as a form of scientific verification created a paradigm of profound consequence. For Orlov, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Helsinki Accords were akin to physical postulates. They were a set of axiomatic principles whose validity could be tested against the empirical reality of state behavior. The Moscow-Helsinki Group, which he co-founded with Yelena Bonner and Ludmila Alexeyeva, was conceived as an instrument of measurement. Its purpose was to observe, document, and report on the Soviet Union's adherence to its own signed commitments. This approach transformed the moral appeal for human rights into a disciplined, evidence-based critique. It provided a framework that was difficult for the Soviet authorities to dismiss as mere emotional dissent, framing their actions as a direct violation of international law and logical consistency. This method linking security, economics, and human rights into a single, verifiable system was a powerful intellectual tool. It armed dissidents within the Eastern Bloc and gave Western diplomats, such as those in the Carter administration, a potent and principled language for engagement. The idea that a nation's internal respect for rights was a valid metric of its international reliability became a central theme in Cold War diplomacy, an intellectual lineage traceable directly to the clear-eyed, methodical approach pioneered by Orlov. His intellectual journey can be perceived through a lens borrowed from his own field, possessing a quality of wave-particle duality. The particle aspect is found in the discrete, measurable achievements of the specific equations for beam focusing, the founding charter of a monitoring group, the articles on arms control. These are his localized, tangible impacts on the world. The wave aspect is his broader, more diffuse influence the propagation of an idea. This is the enduring concept of asterisk in acomistly asterisk, or thinking otherwise, which he championed as a biological and social necessity for any system's survival and evolution. A society that suppresses dissent, in his view, was like a species that eliminates genetic variation that becomes brittle, unable to adapt, and doomed to extinction. This idea, a fusion of cybernetics, physics, and political philosophy, spread far beyond the confines of his own circle, resonating with intellectuals and reformers who sought a rational basis for a more open political culture. His mathematical models of the arms race, while perhaps limited in their predictive power, served a similar function. It demonstrated that the logic of mutual assured destruction could be subjected to the same kind of formal analysis as any other dynamic system, thereby demystifying it and opening it to rational debate. What, then, is the enduring question that Yuri Orlov's life and work pose for us? It is a profound inquiry into the efficacy of reason in a world so often governed by power, ideology, and fear. Orlov operated as if the principles of logic and evidence ought to be sovereign. He constructed arguments with the precision of a mathematical proof and expected them to be assessed on their merits. His reward for this intellectual integrity was exile and imprisonment by a system for which truth was a flexible commodity, subordinate to the demands of the state. His entire life can be seen as a grand, painful experiment testing the hypothesis that a commitment to objective reality can withstand and ultimately reshape a political order built on its denial. The outcome of that experiment remains contested, a central tension of the modern age. In the final analysis, Yuri Orlov's legacy is one of courageous coherence. He refused to partition his mind, applying the same exacting standards of evidence and logic to the quantum world and the political one. He was the ultimate experimentalist, taking the full measure of the universe around him. In the laboratory, he designed instruments to track the fleeting paths of subatomic particles, making the invisible world of physics visible. In society, he forged organizations to document the subtle and overt abuses of state power, making the invisible suffering of individuals visible and undeniable. He sought to measure reality, in all its forms, against a constant and universal standard, be it the laws of electromagnetism or the principles of human dignity. His life stands as a powerful assertion that the pursuit of truth is a singular, indivisible enterprise, one that demands the whole of a person's intellect, courage, and humanity.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.